Here's the harsh reality. Over 130,000 families retire every single month without any financial income plan. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the 10 Fears of Retirement. Now, remember a couple things from the first podcast. I wanted to give everybody a little bit of background about who I am, why I'm doing this, why I do what I do. This is going to be the first podcast where I start getting into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes. I'm teeing you up for the real good stuff. So we're going to be talking about chapter 1 of the book, 10 Fears of Retirement. And the first chapter is creating a path to follow. And really what this is all about, it's about goal setting, and it's also about having some tough conversations with yourself and your spouse if you haven't already had them. And one of the things before I kind of start getting into the meat and potatoes of the chapter 1, creating a path to follow, is, when it comes to these conversations of retirement planning, it's really like any facet of life. If you're walking down the street and let's say you don't have your phone on you or a GPS, and you're like, hey, I'm going to go up to the store, but you have no idea where the store is, and you just start walking. It's probably going to take you a lot longer to find one than if you already knew where you were going and you had a specific path to follow. And you'd be like, yeah, Alex, that sounds like common sense. I'd say, yeah, that is common sense. But here's the harsh reality. I was looking at a statistic, and I actually mentioned this in chapter 1 of the book. Over 130,000 families retire every single month without any financial income plan. And now I'm going to be spending some time on the importance of income planning or distribution planning in a later chapter. But think about that. That means there's 130,000 families this month that are going to retire, and they have no idea how much money they spend a month. They have no idea how much money they need to be taking out of their accounts or retirement accounts to help fill that gap. They don't know how much their Social Security is or is not. That stuff scares me. That gives me anxiety. And so this chapter is really talking about what I'm really going to get into here is what are your goals for retirement? What are the costs of living? How much does it cost you monthly to live comfortably? Take care of bills, your immediate expenses. Hey, how much is it when you go on vacation? Are you going to be a snowbird? Are you from the north? I'm from Michigan, and a large portion of my clients, when right after the holidays, they say, hey, Alex, we're out of here, right? We're going south for 3 or 4 months, and we'll see you in the spring. Do you have that accounted in your expenses on your lifestyle, your monthly goals? And then again, getting back into the lifestyle, are you going to be somebody who goes on one trip a year and you're a snowbird? Are you going on big trips right out of the gate? And maybe those first 5 years of your retirement, you might spend more than you do the rest of your retirement, right? Because there is a harsh reality. There's all those cheesy sayings and all that when it comes to retirement. Hey, there's the go-go years, right? Which is usually the 60s. Then you have your slow go years, right? And that's the 70s. And then the 80s, people usually coin it the no-go years, right? You're not doing much. You probably got more medical expenses. The body's not, as fluid as it once was. So you might not be going on all these vacations and doing all these fun entertainment things. So, that's where it all starts. Is you got to sit down, again, whether it's yourself or your spouse, and go through the checklist. Some of the most important questions that I always ask families when I'm talking to them about their financial plan in retirement is this. Number 1, I've already said it twice. I'm going to say it again. How much do you need a month to be comfortable? When you go on vacations, how much money does that cost? And let's make sure we bake that in with that average monthly cost. Or maybe it's a lump sum on a certain quarter or certain month of the year. How much are you going to have on income guaranteed? What do I mean by that? What's your Social Security like monthly, right? Are you going to be doing spousal claiming? Do you have a widower's benefit, anything like that? Those are conversations you need to have. So, hey, what's that Social Security? Are you lucky enough to have a pension? How much is that monthly, right? Do you have any veteran benefits that you're getting on a monthly basis? Hey, let's really dissect what that monthly income need versus what's already coming in looks like, because that's going to be really important to understand that gap on how much you need to be taken out of your, retirement accounts, 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, Roths, whatever that looks like. Okay. So that's the first thing, is understanding the cost, understanding what that looks like. And then we're going to take it to a next step. Okay. What are the grandioso, the quote unquote, hey, what's the bucket list items, right? Are you trying to, a lot of times when I sit down with a family who's new to retirement, Alex, I want to go to Italy. We want to go see all the national parks, and they'll have all these great goals. And I say, what's really, really great about that is you guys have had these conversations. You know what you want to do. Now the fun part is you just got to put them on the calendar and start knocking them out. Because that's the saddest thing that I go through in my career outside of course, somebody passing away and losing a family or a client that I've worked with, is when I sit down with a family and maybe it's 3, 4, 5 years later, and I ask them and I kind of go through the plan, and before I sit down with families, I always go back and I look at that initial note I put in from our first meeting. And usually I'm talking about goals, and I'll go back and I'll look through. And the worst part is when I talk to a family, it's been, again, 3, 4, 5 years, and they've done nothing on that list. Because the toughest thing about retirement and us setting all these goals is, I think Mike Tyson had a great quote, right? Everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the face. And that's exactly what retirement can do. I just sat down with a client the other day, and they had these wonderful plans. They were going to buy a boat. They were going to go sail around the Caribbean, spend their first 5 years sailing. They're big sailors. And unfortunately, his parents got sick. And so now for 2 years in a row, they've basically been, at-home nurses taking care of his parents who have some serious medical issues. They couldn't plan on that, right? It wasn't ideal, and it's really delayed their entire goal of what they wanted to do, which they've worked their whole life for. So is there a reality to the game of life throwing curveballs? Yes. But more important, it's about having those plans written down, scheduled plan, so you know where you're going to go. So it makes it a little bit of fun because there's 3 parts. And so the first kind of part of what I wanted to talk about in this chapter was the big picture. Hey, we're setting goals. We're understanding our budgeting, our needs, the lifestyle that we want to live. But then I'm going to get into something now that is very important you understand. There's 3 phases of creating that path to follow, right, when it comes to your retirement. And the 3 parts that I like to talk about more here in this capacity, more on a personal level, is there's going to be 3 changes that take place throughout your retirement process. And it's usually different for everybody, but there's 3 things that always are there. The first is the financial, right? Hey, how much do you need a month? How much do you have going in? What rate of return do you need to get on your money? And again, we're going to talk about this in a much more depth on income planning in another chapter. But there's the financial conversation. Can I afford to retire? Does it make sense with my lifestyle, my goals, my income needs? Okay, great. There's the first part, financial. And everybody talks about the financial piece, candidly, which is why I have a job, right? People look for an expert, a professional, and that's why I have a job. So the financial piece is the first piece that people think about and discuss in retirement. Well, what's the second piece? It gets more into the psychological piece. And then the third is emotional. And that's psychological and emotional. They can absolutely be tied to each other. And I'll use my parents as an example. My parents, both teachers, long, great careers, have pensions, luckily. Didn't have millions of dollars when they retired. They were teachers, right? And they were, middle to lower class. In the grand scheme of things, I'd say it was middle class citizens, lived a good life, comfortable. And my mom, when she retired, she had worked her way up through the teaching ranks, and she taught visually impaired students and kids and families. So when she retired from the state, and she had a more leadership job, and she had a lot of people asking her for her time. Her schedule was jam-packed all the time. And when she retired, she really dealt with a lot of that emotional and psychological hurdles, because all of a sudden, you go from your day being jam-packed for 7 to 8 hours every day and a bunch of people needing time from you and needing your attention, to all of a sudden you're retired and that's not there anymore. And so that self-worth relationship is a real thing you need to think about. And the first thing I would talk about specific to my mom is, hey, it's important to have outside goals. And what do I mean by that? Or activities. Up here where I'm from in Michigan, we play euchre, right? So she joined a euchre league, joining a golf league. She's a big golfer. having activities that are set up weekly so you still have some form of a schedule and a regimented week, right? A lot of people, and I'll get into this in more detail later, part-time work will really help with that psychological, emotional issue. A lot of the times people's work is their social component, right? All their friends are at work. They talk to their people who they're friends at work and through the work environment. So then all of a sudden you're not showing up to work, and guess what? You don't have any more friends, and you're not chit-chatting. You're not sitting at the water cooler having those conversations. And then all of a sudden you have this void, okay? And that is also something that can stem into that emotional, psychological part of retirement. And then the last piece. So, hey, the part-time work, giving yourself something to kind of, coast into, have something go do on a regular basis, having these activities, these goals, these hobbies, if you will. And then the other part is knowing it's coming. Really, this is important. My dad, right? So I was talking about my mom, and let's talk about my dad. My dad, when he retired, he went into it seamlessly. He was like, yeah, great. I'm gonna go golf. He had the euchre league. He loves gardening and spending time outside doing the landscaping. He's always got projects around the house he's working on. On that subject, those first 2 years of retirement, you're probably going to spend more than you expect. Kind of the running joke is, hey, I have 6 Saturdays and a Sunday. Well, what do you usually do on Saturday when you're home? You go up to Home Depot, you go spend money, you do these kind of honey-do list items, and then all of a sudden now you're retired and you got that for 6 days. A lot of people spend a lot more money on their house on upgrades, projects, things they've put off for a long time, right? And that's what happened to my dad. So he retires. He jumps right into it. He's golfing. He does part-time work. He was a substitute teacher, and he loved it. He had no problem with the transition. He's had a couple little jobs pop up here and there he can go do and keep him busy for a couple months. But my mom really struggled with it out of the gate because she didn't have all these things already in place. And so that's kind of my A and my B is understand, there's a financial conversation when it comes to retirement, and that's fine, right? And that's usually what people are going to talk about. And you need to do your due diligence on understanding what that budgeting looks like. And are you in a good spot to retire or not? And again, that's a whole nother chapter. We're going to talk about this. But then those second pieces of the psychology and the emotional aspects of retiring and making sure you understand what those look like for you and being realistic with yourself. Because the toughest part of my job is when people don't have these conversations. They walk into my office and I start asking questions. Hey, what do you want to do in retirement? I know you guys are going to be retiring in 6 months. Well, we really haven't talked about it, Alex. Oh, well, let's talk about it. What do you guys want to do? And this is extreme. And what I'm doing right now is I'm basically saying, hey, don't do this. Don't not have these conversations, especially if you have a spouse, right? It takes 2 to tango. I have a client experience that I went through, and I'll give you a worst case scenario. I walk into the room. They'd never talked about it. He wanted to retire in about 6 months. He worked in the golf industry, and he was one of the maintenance folks for a big golf course. And he's like, listen, I'm going to retire. I'm retiring here. And then we have a condo in Costa Rica that we're going to move to, and we're going to live in Costa Rica for half the year. And she leans over and looks at him and says, well, that's the first I've heard this, right? So I get to sit there and witness them getting into a pretty much knockdown, drag out argument. She's like, I was planning on working 2 more years. They had never talked about it until they're sitting in front of me and I'm asking these conversations. Now, I was able to say, hey, guys, don't feel, everything we talk about is concrete. There's a lot of moving parts, which is another thing I'm going to talk about. Retirement will change 400 times. Every single year, your retirement picture will look different than the year before because like my prior comment, we don't always get to see the medical, the parenting needs, family issues that pop up. So understand all these things are going to change year to year. And that's what I told them. I said, guys, whatever we agree to today and whatever we start talking about, it's the foundation. It's where we start. And every year it's going to take some right and left turns, and you've got to be okay with the concept of a moving target in retirement, okay? But what you don't want to do is end up starting to have these conversations for the first time sitting down with a professional like myself. And then what ended up happening, and why I tell you it was a worst case scenario, is he's like, hey, I'm done in 6 months. She's like, hey, I want to work 2 more years. And she's like, I don't want to go to Costa Rica and I don't want to, deal with the condo. I thought that was just going to be a vacation thing. Well, me and the gentleman kept in touch. And we ended up talking about 2 months later, and I just followed up with them and I said, hey guys, wanted to follow up with you. I got everything done on the plan. I know you had some questions about taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to get that in front of you. He said, yeah, let's set up a time next week, but it's only going to be me. I said, okay, great. No problem. Is everything okay? Well, actually, after the meeting we had, it's actually spiraled pretty bad, and we're actually talking about getting a divorce. And again, this is an extreme scenario, but my point goes back to it's so important that you have these conversations. It can be fun, right? I always encourage my families that I work with, hey, you're retiring next year. Do me a favor, guys. Go grab a bite to eat and start talking about some of the things you want to do. Talk about the places you want to travel. Do you or do you not want to be snowbirds, right, if you're up from the north? So it's important to communicate, have these conversations with your spouse. If you're a one-person army, just be thinking about it. Write down goals, right? Put down a list of what you want to do. Because, again, it's so important you know where you're going, and that is the main topic of this first chapter. Have a path to follow. Set these goals. Yeah, finance is what we're talking about, but there's also a bunch of this other stuff that falls into the picture. Hey, when do you plan on taking your Social Security? Right? Are you old enough to take your Social Security? Should you be doing spousal benefits, or should you just be taking your own benefit? On that, I do talk about it a little bit in chapter 1, and so I'll reference it. A lot of people will bring to me concerns about Social Security. Again, I'm going to have a whole chapter that we talk about Social Security, and in this podcast, I'm actually going to be bringing in a local expert on Social Security, which I'm really excited about. So make sure you do not miss that episode. That one's going to have a lot of nuggets in it. But big picture on Social Security is this. Hey, Alex, is Social Security going to be there for me? Right? That's always one of the things we talk about when we're talking about, hey, creating a path to follow. When do you take Social Security as part of that conversation? Everybody's worried it's going to run out, right? Hey, I've seen this number change 3 times in the last 3 years. Hey, Alex, it's going to be somewhere between 2034 and 2035, supposedly this Social Security OASDI trust fund is now going to have a negative balance coming in. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go back in the history of Social Security, the statistics were basically like when it first started in the 1930s, it was like 37 people working to 1 person taking out a benefit. Those are some good numbers, right? Well, the problem is now, we're give or take over 100 years later, right? And you get into this place where we're flirting with 100 years later, and now the math is flipped. People are living longer. We don't have 37 people working and 1 taking it out. The baby boomers were the biggest working class. So now we actually have a reverse problem. We don't have enough people in the workforce going into work. Our largest, volume of workforce, the baby boomers, are all retiring. And so now it's actually like a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 people working and 1 taking it out. Well, that math gets a little bit tight. And again, where it's really going to start mattering for the people listening is it's going to be right around 2033, 2034, maybe 2035. These numbers keep changing. And then what's going to happen, it's going to be 0.76 people working to 1 person taking it out. Well, that's bad math. So when we get into Social Security, again, I'm going to have an expert on. We're going to dive into that one. But that is absolutely one of the things you have to consider when we're talking about, hey, creating a path to follow. Inflation, is that going to be a thing? Yeah, it is a thing. You got to bake that into your plan. Emergency funds, medical, something goes wrong with the furnace, the car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You got to bake this stuff into the plan. And I had commented earlier about the part-time work. And this will be one of the kind of last things I want to talk about when I'm reviewing chapter 1 here, because chapter 1's a little bit different pertaining to, I'm talking about the fun stuff of retirement, goal setting, right? How much do we want to spend? What do we want to do with our time? What's the lifestyle? Where do we live? How long do we live there? Is there legacy planning? The fun stuff. But one of the last things I want to talk about when we're reviewing chapter 1 is the work concept of part-time, full-time, people having to go back to work. So like the 2 worst case scenarios of any retirement plan is this. hey, I've retired and now I have to go back to work. That's a terrible scenario because oftentimes it's A or B. And what I mean by that is, hey, I either have to go back to work or I have to move in with the kids, right? And neither of those are a good scenario to be in. And so oftentimes you have a good income plan and that solves that. But let's talk about the work component for 1 second. So oftentimes I will encourage families, I've never said this isn't a good idea, is getting a part-time job, like I had referenced earlier in the podcast, is always a good idea. Hey, you have a little bit of extra money coming in. That can't hurt. You're getting out of the house 2, 3, 4 days a week, whatever that looks like. It usually can't hurt you. Now, the issue I've run into when people do part-time work and they do it right out of the gate is they do it with the company that they just left and they were leaving because they had a high stress environment or they had a boss they didn't like working for. Well, that doesn't change. You're just doing it less per week, but it's still there. And so oftentimes I'll encourage families, just based on my experience, again, being in the business over a decade, sitting down with over 2,000 families, those things have helped me learn through experience without being retired, obviously. Okay, you're gonna do some part-time work. Do something you're passionate about. And again, this might seem like common sense, but I tell you what, I do not see a lot of people having these conversations and even thinking through this. Hey, you love to garden. Go work at a garden center in the summer and the fall, right? Hey, you're a big golfer, right? There's all these simulators you can go to. They got all these different golf courses you can go work on. You can be a starter, right? I can go right down the list. If you're really passionate about something, and you really enjoy something. Hey, you're one of those people who, you can fix anything and you're great with your hands. Go work at the hardware store, right? Go get a job where you get out of the house. You kind of surround yourself with people that, you add some value. You meet some great people. Don't go back to doing the same stuff that stressed you out. Now, the tough part with that and the catch-22 is if you're somebody who's a high-level executive or you have a very, very niche or niche, however you want to say that, right? My sister always busts me up. She says, Alex, it's niche. And I say niche, but whatever. Is, you get into that situation where you're a consultant and you could go do this consulting job for 3 months and make $100,000, right? That's hard to say no to. So you got to balance out those options. And what does, if you're considering part-time work, it look like? But make sure it does not trump your whole goal of retirement. It should fit into it, should be a part of that social environment, should be a part of that maybe supplemental income. Because again, I've never sat down with a family and said, oh, hey, you making this extra $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month is going to hurt you. That's not the case, okay? Now, if you're claiming Social Security, make sure you don't make too much. I'll bounce that out to when we do the Social Security podcast, but that is absolutely something you need to consider. Don't make too much money from part-time work if you're taking your Social Security. And again, we'll talk more about that. Now, let's say you're doing some full-time work and you're retired. And you'd say, well, Alex, that doesn't sound like retirement. What are you talking about? I just had a client this year, retired a few years ago from GM. And he was an executive, had a higher up job. And then he retires and his daughter wants to start a business. So he's an entrepreneur at heart. So he jumps in and starts helping his daughter start a company. And now all of a sudden he's got a company he didn't expect. He loves it. It's different. He's building something for his family. It's almost legacy for him. And so that stuff also, I see that happening a lot more in recent times than I did historically in my career. Kind of have people having a second career, right? Maybe it's a family business. Maybe you wanted to open up this antique shop, right? And you're doing it because you love it. So understanding that work, part-time, full-time, whatever it looks like, needs to be considered when you're going into retirement. Can it pop up throughout the years and you're 5 years into retirement and something pops up? Absolutely. These things are going to happen. And that's kind of that curveball of life. But the whole point of this chapter and the whole thing I want to encourage is it's so important to have the tough conversations up front. Yeah, financially, yeah, emotionally, and yeah, psychologically. And think about this. Know yourself. Be honest with yourself, right? My mom and my dad, going back to that, my mom struggled out of the gate because she didn't have as many things in place as my dad did right out of the gate. And now you fast forward 7, 8, 9 years and she fell into a routine and things are all well. But it took her some time to do that. And she had to go through some internal struggles. So make sure that you do your due diligence. I always tell people it's the end of the year. You're getting into the holiday season. You're coming into, the New Year's. Everybody's at all these goals. that's a good time to sit down, figure out your budget, figure out, hey, how many more years? If it's not next year, when are you going to retire? How much do you have in the bank, and how much do you want to have in the bank when you retire, right? How much do you want to spend a month? What trips do you want to go on? Do you or do you not want to leave your family money, legacy, right? And again, I'm not going to get into the tax strategies and all that stuff. That's going to be for other podcasts that we have in this series. But this one, again, creating a path to follow. Have tough conversations with yourself. Have tough conversations with your spouse. Think and talk about and put onto paper and put action items, right? Make them SMART goals. I talk about that in the book, SMART goals, right? Give yourself a certain amount of time to accomplish or have something set. So create the path, but then create these deadlines and these specific action items that force you to take action on this retirement planning, right? Because what ends up happening, and I referred to it earlier, time will move fast, and all of a sudden you're retired. And you're like, wait, I'm busier in retirement than I was in my job. Why? Because everybody around you is going to start asking for things, right? You got 6 Saturdays and 1 Sunday. And you have more time to do the things you want to do. But again, you're going to get pulled in different directions. So without a plan, all of a sudden it becomes this other thing. And so make sure that you take the time and have those conversations and those goal setting appointments with yourself, your spouse, and what that looks like. Creating a path to follow, chapter 1 in the book. This is a fun one. It should be a fun time to go through. It should be exciting where you're getting ready for retirement. You've worked your whole life to get to this place. You owe it to yourself to spend some time. It's like and again, I'll kind of end with this. One of the worst stories I ever heard. I was watching a documentary. I think it was called like the Barkley Marathon or something like that. And they asked this kid, he goes out and wins this marathon, whereas, they run over this mountain like 3 or 4 times and it's over like 2 or 3 days and it's insane. And he got done and they asked him, like, well, why'd you do this? He's like, well, my dad worked his whole life. And he always told me, son, you got to get a job, you got to save, you got to work hard, and then you get to enjoy your retirement, And his dad died, like literally, it was like either right before or right after the guy retired. So he works his whole life. He has all these grandiose ideas, this great bucket list, and then never does a single one and basically died without doing anything he wanted to do personal-wise, right? He sacrificed for his family and for his work. And so you've worked hard to get where you're at. Make sure you put that time in. That's the saddest scenario I ever see. So, the good news is you're in control of these things. And again, there's never a good time to do it. There's never a good time to retire. There's never going to be a perfect time to retire. There's never going to be a perfect time to sit down and do these things. It takes some discipline. It takes taking action. But I promise you, for every minute planned, you're saving 45 minutes on the back end, right? So spend the time, put the tough conversations in, have those heart-to-hearts with yourself, create that path, and then you know where you're going, and it makes it a lot more enjoyable throughout the path. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Make sure you listen in next week. We're going to be getting into chapter 2, and that's where the rubber hits the road. We're going to start talking about income planning, Social Security, different investments, all the fun stuff of retirement. So I hope you enjoyed it today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next podcast. God bless you.